Good morning, and welcome to Media Monitor, the show that monitors and evaluates the news stories here and internationally throughout the week. My name is Peter Ndoro, and this is what's coming up on the show today. We're going to ask the question, was the media caught off guard when it was announced this week that the country had slipped into a recession? We'll also be highlighting the plight of journalists who are attacked for doing their work. And was the inclusion of former NFL, that's American football, rugby almost, player Colin Kaepernick in its new Nike 30th anniversary commercial, Just Do It. Was that a good marketing strategy? We'll be unpacking that and more. But first, let's take a look at what you're waking up to in terms of Sunday newspaper headlines. Well, the Sunday Times is leading with a story about top ANC bigwigs, including former President Jacob Zuma, are plotting in secret to oust President Cyril Ramaphosa. The article reveals that Zuma had a clandestine meeting, allegedly, with staunch backers, including ANC Secretary General Ace Magashule, former Northwest Premier Supra Mahumapelo, and ANC Women's League Secretary General Mejo Matuba, and ANC Youth League KZN Secretary Tandukolo Sabelo at the Maharani Hotel in Durban on Thursday. The City Press, well, that is leading with a story on how Bosasa, now known as African Global Operations, has since 2013 been treating a long list of high-profile ministers and government functionaries to high-security systems to their homes. Gwede Mantashe, Nomvula Mukonyane, Deputy Minister Tabang Makwetla, former SAA Chairperson Dudu Mieni, former prisons boss Lindamti, one-time procurement manager for the Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa, PRASA, and Bulelo Ngikana were at the receiving end of Bosasa's largesse, with top ANC MPs rounding off that list. The Sunday Independent, well, that's running with a story on how pressure is mounting on President Cyril Ramaphosa to come up with concrete solutions to address the uncertainty surrounding the future of South Africa's economy after this week's figures from Stats SA confirmed that the country had indeed slipped into a recession for the first time in 9 years. Now, the Sunday Tribune is running with about the Magistrates Commission's move to suspend KwaZulu-Natal's Regional Court Presidential Eric Nzimande over allegations of misconduct. The Weekend Argus, that's leading with a story about how the South African Human Rights Commission has put its weight behind organizations taking up the fight for euthanasia, who believe that they are close to have the practice legalized in the country. Crossing our border into Swaziland, the Sunday Observer there is carrying a headline about 5 truck drivers who died in a horrific accident in Durban. The men were on their way home after failing to offload their consignment. And in West Africa, Nigeria's Daily Trust is running with a story about former governor of Kano State, Malam Ibrahim Shekarau, announcing that he would suspend his presidential ambitions in the 2019 general elections. So those are your Sunday newspapers. Right, we'll take a look at some of those stories a little bit later on the program. But first, let's begin with this. South Africa's economy has slipped into a recession. The economy was last in recession in 2009. Ratings agency Moody's said that the slide into recession in the second quarter would worsen fiscal and monetary challenges. It said that weaker than expected economic data was credit negative. Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa has been trying to reassure citizens that South Africa will soon recover from recession and that he has a plan for economic growth. Joining us in studio to discuss this, we're now joined by media analyst Shoni Mukari. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to you. And SABC senior economics reporter Tsepo Munkhai. Thanks very much for joining us. Hi. Okay, so recession or not recession? Technically, we are in recession, and perhaps let's get the jargon out the way. And we'll start with you, Tsepo. What is a technical recession? And is there a difference between a recession and a technical recession?
Well, it's a question of semantics, and we know that the phrase recession is not palatable politically. So politicians will always try to, put it in a way that perhaps can suit their agenda. I mean, we remember we started hearing about recession back in 2007, 2008. And at that time, Minister of Finance, Trevor Manuel, kept on saying, we're not in recession, we're not in a recession. But all economists were saying, well, if you look at the figures, clearly we are in a recession. But he said, well, the figures have not confirmed it. In a way, there was a bit of a difference in understanding, because the then governor of the Reserve Bank, Tito Mboweni, eventually acknowledged that, well, we will not be surprised if we find ourselves in a recession. And indeed, the figures did confirm that we were in a recession, and it took place. It did show that.
Okay, I'm going to labour this point a little bit, because I want to be clear on this whole technical recession sure. or not recession. There are some economists who say, look, you can't use 2 quarters. You should be measuring year on year, and if we do that, then we're not in recession. And I, as an accountant, tend to want to go with that, because we look at financial statements and we compare one year to the next year, not one quarter to the next quarter. Could there be an argument for saying that, we should really be looking at an economy over a year and comparing year-on-year figures rather than quarter to quarter?
I would say, sometimes when you look at the quarter-on-quarter, you start to have a better understanding of how the economy is going to perform. The reason why you're starting to see the likes of the Reserve Bank revising their economic growth downward, they're simply looking at the figure on quarter and say that given how the economy is performing at this moment, we don't think that we'll be able to reach a growth north of 2%, 1.5%, and we are likely to see others also entering the fray and revising their growth downward after this 6 months of a shrink in output. We are going to see others also starting to revise their numbers. And also, it gives rating agencies and others who are looking at this economy a better understanding of what is likely to happen. And it's showing that we are going to expect a lackluster economic growth for this 2018.
And of course, it always depends on which economists you talk to on what particular day. The media have to try and make sense of this, Shoni, and I just wonder, did we miss something? Did it take us by surprise? Were we caught off guard? Or, could we have known?
Well, if you look into the newsrooms across the country, I think you'll find very few economists. Not to say that there are people who are not, well versed on economic issues. Yeah. So to be able to analyze and be able to predict when economists who are also unable to predict that, and it is their job to do that on a day-to-day basis, I wouldn't really blame journalists for not being able to predict it. But certainly, I think the emphasis in terms of what is being reported, I think there's an element of hype that is probably not necessarily unwarranted. We're reporting this issue as if we're in a depression. That's a totally different issue altogether. And yes, the economy is contracting. It is also contracting at a slower pace if you compare the 2 quarters that have been reported. So I'm not saying it's not something that is not newsworthy. Certainly something to be worried about, especially if you look at all the other macroeconomic issues. We still have high unemployment. Inflation is now beginning to tick upwards. Other factors like, oil price, which impacts the petrol price in South Africa, and, it spreads into all other goods and services. So there are issues to be worried about, and I'm glad that the president has also taken the issue and is responding to it.
All right, we will get to that whole recession, depression thing, but I'm Jabu Sutole. I'm sitting in front of my stoop in Soweto somewhere, and I'm hearing all of this recession, depression, Q1, Q2, what. Has the media done a good enough job to explain what it all means for Jabu? Because actually it affects him, and he may not realize that.
No, indeed. I think on that sphere, we tend not to go down to the detail of actually saying that, you know, when the economy is contracting, that means fewer goods and services are being produced, which means, what does that mean to you? Can we have a supply and demand issue that then impacts on prices later on down the line? So to that effect, I don't think there was enough. We don't tend to bring the stories down to the men and women on the street. So that I understand, okay, when you say there's a recession or a depression, what will that mean for me? Will I not find bread tomorrow morning when I go to my supermarket?
Yeah, all right. You're the definition man. What's the difference between a depression and a recession? My understanding is that America, for example, has had more than 30 recessions, but only 2 depressions since the 1800s.
No, absolutely. The depression is more of a heavier word. I mean, and recession, we've been in a recession and we've managed to come out of it. Basically, it's 6 months of contraction in goods and services. Others will look at it as a quarter, which is 2 consecutive quarters where there is a contraction. But what is interesting is that these figures are backward looking. That is why you'll hear politicians saying, well, we are not in a recession at the moment. It's true, we are not in a recession at the moment, but if you look at from January to June, those are the figures that came out this week, and they indicate that at that time we've seen a contraction in the economy. And I mean, the other issue you mentioned is on how the coverage, if you may allow it. In 2009, when the figures confirmed that we're in a recession, there was a very little understanding of what this is all about. It was mainly your financial papers who covered this, but many people were struggling to understand. Even they came up with phrases, presenters and anchors, they came up with phrases, especially for the other African languages. They did not know how to coin this particular word. Yes. And I think they still are grappling to coin a word across, because I listened to one radio station and 2 presenters, they refer to it differently based on their understanding of what a recession is.
All right, so we're running out of time, so I want to speed this up a little bit. But so the Sunday Independent, I think, is running with a story, and it's saying Cyril Ramaphosa, recession denial. So is he downplaying what we're facing, or has he got it right? I mean, he talks about he believes that it will be corrected. Now, this time last year, 2017 June, I remember headlines: South Africa in recession. And of course, that figure was eventually corrected. So when he says this will be corrected, what is he saying? That he's going to fix the economy, or he's hoping Stats SA is going to correct those figures?
Well, his job is to fix the economy and not to, manipulate the numbers. And I don't think he's able to do that. But figures are revised either upward or downward all the time by Statistics South Africa. Well, we certainly don't hope that this is going to be the case, where we'll find that we're not suddenly in a recession. My understanding is that perhaps the stimulus package that he has put together would be able to correct what we have experienced in the first 6 months of this year, because the president will not have powers to...
If you take out agriculture, are we still in trouble?
I think so. I mean, manufacturing, mining, they are still underperforming, and they probably will continue underperforming if you look at what the global economy is starting to do, starting to performing in a way that perhaps it could affect us in a bad way. We are an export economy, and we need to get our goods out. And if the global economy is not doing well, it might take us a while to get.
All right, okay, Tsepo, we're going to have to leave it there. Shoni, you're going to stay with us, but thanks very much for your insights and giving us some kind of background to some of the jargon that we hear all the time. But thanks very much indeed. All right, okay, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, more on Media Monitor.
Where am I going to sleep now? What about my kids?
There is bribe involved because we are not aware that they will come today.
People are being evicted about 2 months ago in May. We served the first court order. This is private property.
They came to us with a truck that has no water.
How do we build these checks in a way that we don't have a fire spread when we have a fire incident?
They've wasted our time, they've made our members to go on strike, they've made the public to suffer for nothing.
Andikwazi ukutya i-treatment ngenxa into yoba imali ayikho. Ndifumene i-600. Xa ndiphinda futhi ndidrowa ayiphumi ayikho kwakwi-account.
What we are experiencing now is due to the number of people accessing the system at the same time. So if they can just be patient for 3 to 4 days.
We visit all the best spots for some live jazz performances. Traveling to breathtaking holiday destinations is what we like doing. Enjoying outdoor adventures with family and friends. Relish global cuisines.
Part of cooking.
For all the tourism, delicious cuisines and outdoor adventures, join us on Trends Travel every Sunday at 12 o'clock right here on the SABC News channel.
Welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor. Now a story that concerns us as journalists. A Myanmar court has sentenced 2 Reuters journalists, Walone, who's 32, and Kyo So, who's 28, to 7 years in prison. The pair was investigating the killing of villagers from the Rohingya Muslim minority and other abuses involving soldiers and police in the village of Indin at the time of their arrest last December. They pleaded not guilty at the time of their arrest, but in a turn of events, the journalists were found guilty on official secrets charges. Meanwhile, a group of activists marched to the Myanmar consulate to protest against the jailing of the journalists, calling for their immediate release. Journalists in Uganda, back on the continent, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Nigeria have also been targeted. Let's take a look at some background on this.
Our demand is very clear, that they should release the 2 reporters, and they should come out to apologize for the massacre and take out all the involved officers, including the military force, to the court to face legal judgment, and need to apologize and to compensate the damages to all the Rohingya people in Myanmar. The Rohingya people, the Myanmar people, and the rest of the world should thanks to their courage. They bravely reported the incident of the massacre in Myanmar, which we know it is entirely a genocide, an ethnic cleansing. We want to thank him. We want to relay our gratitude to them, and I hope they can stand up. Don't be afraid of the imprisonment.
Press freedom is one of the basic pillars of democracy. If we don't have press freedom, who would report what's happening among the grassroots people? Who would report the abuses committed by the people in power? And who would report the things that are being clamored for by the people? So the press freedom is very important for us.
All right, so that's setting up our discussion now. And joining me is a small little panel of guests, SABC journalists and analysts on African affairs. Issa Khoma, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for
and Shoni, you've met him just before the break. So this situation in Myanmar, sadly, is not isolated. I'm going to start with you, Issa. We're seeing it on the continent as well, but let's start in Myanmar. And it is quite concerning to see the plight of journalists there. And just the difficulty that they have to work.
Oh yes, I mean, Myanmar is very bad, it's very serious, and the most serious case is another case in Bangladesh, where there was a photojournalist who came up, I think it was on Al Jazeera, and he criticized the way that the police were actually sort of handling the students who were demonstrating. Now that man is in jail. So basically, in Southeast Asia, situation of journalists is very bad. Cambodia, even Thailand, Indonesia, and the continent is also in the same situation. So basically, the job of a journalist, there's a lot of occupational hazards involved. Yeah.
Shoni, how is it in 2018 that governments and authorities are still trying to muzzle the media? I mean, we work and live in a world where social media carries on regardless. These stories are going to get out, and we can see, you know, what is really going on behind this story in Myanmar. Why do they do it? And why target journalists still in 2018?
Well, clearly, we all know that power corrupts, and obviously people in power don't like to have people poking or, you know, having their noses in their affairs. The bottom line is that the media model of one-to-many broadcast model has changed. We have the many-to-many. Everyone who has a cell phone is essentially a journalist. And whether they like it or not, these stories will go out. We have the likes of WikiLeaks, or new versions of WikiLeaks will come up because people know that you know, they need to stand up for their rights. What is concerning for me is that this is not just happening in the developing world. I mean, I think Trump is the champion of journalist-hating fraternity. You know, I don't know if you've seen pictures where there's a certain BBC journalist who's essentially, every time he asks a question, oh, another beauty. That will be the comment from Donald Trump. And every time people in power don't like what the media is doing, either it's called fake news or unbalanced. What is, for me, encouraging is that since the presidency of Cyril Ramaphosa, the journalist hating, at least in South Africa, seems to have subsided a little bit, because there was a lot of, you know, media need to be regulated, they need to be accredited, and a lot of that talk that is very, very dangerous. But to your point earlier, I think they need to realize that they cannot hide, you know, because people, you know, we're supposed to be promoting governments by the people for the people. So why are you so opposed with people knowing what it is that you're up to?
I suppose a certain type of journalist is going to be more under threat now, and I'm thinking investigative journalists, because they're the ones that really dig deep. The normal stories, everyone will get a social media hit on that, but it's these stories where they get sources and they go undercover and so on and so forth. I guess these are the real targets.
You know, I think the real targets in the developed world is not the journalists, it's the whistleblowers, the Snowdens, yeah, Assange, the man of WikiLeaks, Assange. And there are many others were in jail in the States who were within the system, and they actually sort of blew the whistle on improprieties of the state. So now we find that the whole thing, it's just sort of, it's an access to information. What the Americans say is that the First Amendment is under threat, the right to know and the right to express yourself. Yeah, that is the thing that's under threat. And funny enough, people don't understand this, is this that they say that under the new dispensation of the neoliberal economic dispensation, is this that governments have become more authoritative, much more than liberal, as they say. Yeah, so when you talk of media freedom, I'm not talking about journalists, I'm talking about media freedom. We should not only look at the developing world, we should also look at the developed world, where things are getting serious. Yeah, I mean, over there they realize it, and they're actually fighting back against the system, the authorities, and they're taking them to court. But we don't have that recourse in the third world.
Talking about the third world developing nations, this case, Jones Abiri in Nigeria, detained for 2 years by Nigerian authorities. And again, it's a huge concern where you can be in jail for such a long period of time. And he claims he's done nothing wrong. He says he didn't do anything wrong. Tell us a little bit about, I don't know how much you know about the Jones Abiri case itself, but it seems typical of some countries still now the type of thing that goes on, where it's about harassment and getting you out of the picture more than it is about real charges?
I think without, I really don't have too much detail around that particular case, but what I can say is that I think it's important that not just the media fraternity should be appalled by what's happening, but I think society in general should stand up whenever, you know, freedom of expression, as you put it, is being threatened. And to me, that is the issue that we need to be more worried about. That we can't just say, oh, it's got to do with journalists, it's got nothing to do with us. It's got everything to do with us. It's got everything to do with our freedoms, in particular the freedom of expression.
So
no, the very case, it's a very interesting case. I mean, Biri basically was put in jail. I mean, he has been held in where he was held for 2 years under the Security Act, where they accused him of being a member or actually sort of sponsoring a terrorist organization. And under the Nigerian laws, when it comes to issues of terrorism, there's no way that you can get bail. But you don't get bail for 2 years. People are asking a question. But the truth about the matter with Abiri is that earlier he had actually sort of come up with an article which actually talked about a secret dossier which moved, I think, between the chief of police and the vice president. And he was asked to reveal his source, and he never came to reveal that source. So there's this trumped-up charge that he is involved with one of these terrorist organizations in the Delta State, and he was put in there for 2 years. Now that is typical of all governments, when it comes to state secrecy. They'll do anything to maintain it. Although it's in Nigeria, you find that the Nigerian media and the Nigerian press especially, it's very free. In fact, at times people say it delves to anarchy, where you can almost insult a person and get away with it. But when it comes to state issues, that's where matters get worse. And it's not only Nigeria, it's all over. There are other countries which are worse than that. I mean to say that we're not talking about Rwanda. The country which has got a very bad media record of suppression of media, it's Rwanda. There they've got about 19 journalists who have been killed, murdered. And that's not me. You can go to Human Rights Watch. Yeah, that's from 1994 to 2010. In fact, they've almost silenced the media there. Yeah, we go to Ethiopia before the present dispensation. Journalists were in jail. Yeah.
All right. You know, we're running out of time, but in like 10 seconds, why isn't the African Union taking this as seriously as other human rights abuses? Because that, for me, is where it should be pegged.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised. I think there's very few examples of success in the African Union actually getting something accomplished. So I wouldn't be surprised that they're sitting back and not doing actually anything about this.
All right. Okay, Shoni, we're going to carry on chatting to you after this break. But Isak, thanks very much indeed for giving us your insights on the plight of journalists, particularly on our continent. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me.
All right, we take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll catch you up with what's been happening on social media during the course of the week. Stay with us.
Township under siege, roads blockaded, and the atmosphere here remains tense. Residents want their houses damaged by the storms repaired.
Rains are coming. Who's going to repair my furniture?
Police remain vigilant.
We may never have sufficient members, but the members that we have, we are comfortable with them. We are in a position to deal with the situation.
From us also as councillors, we lack information as it's not cascaded to us.
Welcome to this week's Social Media Wrap. This week we are taking a look at a collaboration between radio and digital news as the SABC News furthers its investigation into the illegal trade of a banned substance called Aldicarb. But first, let's have a look at your social media trends with Tanya Kuri.
Over the past week in social media, certain stories have definitely made more prominence than others, and it's fascinating to see that the Joburg fire story actually gained further traction than the recession story. The nation watched with horror as a building took the lives of 3 very brave firefighters. It is such a big story that it made a bigger impact than the announcement of South Africa being in recession. The ANC blamed Zuma for the recession and the president called for calm, but this story converges with the land reform or land expropriation story inaccurately again. But social media just doesn't care for fact. They just combine stories at will. State capture inquiry is also a massive story this week. This was coupled with the Mutambi versus Williams cross-examinations. Those stories also made social media very angry. And then, of course, Steinhoff. This is one of the largest stories on the charts. Marcus Jooste made no impact in social media that was positive. Social media, again, being the truth barometer and saying that there's no way they're buying his testimony at all.
It's been a busy week for journalists at the SABC. Let's see what you've liked based on the site. The top story on sabcnews.com, as liked by users, is the ANC in the Free State firing 14 councillors for misconduct. Close on its heels, users were very interested in the EFF Student Command's victory in the hotly contested SRC elections at the Durban University of Technology. SABC News' investigation into the illegal poison trade ranks 3rd on the list of what users were interested in. 8 workers who have been killed after an explosion near Somerset West also brought traffic to our website. And finally, South Africa entering a recession for the first time since 2009 got our attention. Now, at least 800 dogs are poisoned with the banned pesticide Aldicarb every week in South Africa. SABC News took to the streets to find out how easily this poison is available, and we speak to Jermaine Krieger from Radio News about the social media reaction on the story.
Is it the... You've also got some. Within seconds of stepping outside the Sunshine Plaza shopping complex in Roodepoort, west of Johannesburg, I'm surrounded by street vendors with a variety of wares. But today, I'm not interested in sunglasses or cell phone chargers.
Big rat problem in there. All my rats and my cockroaches. I just bought a new house and they're everywhere. Okay.
I'm immediately shown the best solution on offer. Grey-black granules in a small, unmarked, clear plastic bag. The vendor is holding at least 50 little bags, but tells me that I would only need 4. Approximately 2 teaspoons worth of poison for my rat problem. It would cost me 20 Rand for the lot. At this, other vendors draw closer. If I buy from them, they'll drop the price even more.
One man, I can give you discount.
Aldicarb, also known as halipirim or two-step, is a pesticide that has been banned in South Africa. Despite this, it is still readily and openly available on any street corner. I think what struck me most about the responses we received from listeners and from viewers on social media was the scope and the impact of the problem. I always realized that Aldicarb posed a risk or a threat, but until the messages started pouring in, I didn't realize just how many people had been affected by the poison in some way or another. The second thing that really stood out for me was the community outrage. The sheer disbelief that despite the fact that 800 dogs are poisoned with Aldicarb per week in South Africa, and the fact that it's used in 100 murders in Johannesburg alone annually, it's still so freely available. Many people use social media to call for action from the authorities and to demand accountability to keep the animals and the people in their lives safe.
That's it for your social media wrap.
For SABC News,
I'm Nina Westhuizen.
I'm Jermaine Krieger in Johannesburg.
Thanks always to our SABC digital news team, the best in the world online news. All right, so Shoni, thanks very much. We're going to take a look at the papers, but just kind of looking at what's been happening on the digital space, do you think that South Africans on social media are connecting with the stories that journalists think are important? Is there a disconnect, or are we converging?
I think they're complementary. On the one hand, obviously the media carries stuff that is considered of national importance, you know, the economy, racism and such things. Whereas social media tends to take the personal space into a public platform, things that are affecting people at an individual level. And yes, newspapers have limited space. They can only focus on so many. So in a way, you could say social media is helping to get to those stories that newspapers would otherwise not find room for them. So there's some level of, complement. They tend to complement each other in some way.
All right, so you and I, pretty old school, we still love opening fresh newspapers on a Sunday morning. You've got them in front of you. Which ones have caught your attention? Which stories and why?
Well, there were a couple. I mean, obviously, the one that I think is actually quite alarming is the expose by the Sunday Times, which is talking about the fact that, Zuma and some of the people who were considered part of the Premier League were plotting to oust the current president of the ANC and president of the Republic, Cyril Ramaphosa. Now, of course, there's no one who's been quoted, but a story like that wouldn't just... I'm hoping that this story is not based purely on people's pictures taken. I know one of the people who were asked from the ANC to comment on the story said, well, what if they were planning a birthday party? We hope, maybe that's what they were doing. But obviously there must be, some truth to what they're saying, because obviously you don't write a story like that without consulting a few sources. And what that says to me is that the problem that Cyril has to deal with goes a lot deeper. Obviously, the people who are implicated, especially in the state capture inquiry, are going to fight back. And I think we are seeing that as part of the fight back campaign. As to whether they will succeed, I mean, one of the stories suggested that the idea of actually trying to call a new general or a new a process, General Council will take too long. So let's take the legal route and see if we cannot have the election at Nasrec to be declared null and void, and that way we get him out of power.
Okay, so that's an interesting story, and the way they covered it, they said that they've asked them and they said that they denied meeting, and then of course the picture. It is quite remarkable, people can take pictures with their cell phones while they're sitting down, pretending not to be paying attention. I mean, you'd think if it was clandestine, they'd do it somewhere quite secret. So maybe it wasn't as shady as one is suggesting. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think the fact that, one, they were asked about it, and then they said, no, it never happened. And then, of course, the pictures shows them clearly the meeting. Says, well, if there's nothing to hide, why lie about it?
Right.
So to me, that is one thing that, raises questions that maybe there is some truth to the story.
All right, so that one's certainly going to play out during the course of the week. There'll be denials, of course. All right, what else got your attention?
Well, there's the issue about the 686 cases at the NPA that have just been sitting gathering dust. To me, that is really shocking. I mean, if anybody ever wondered that if Sean Abrams was not suitable for that job, there is your evidence. But what worries me the most is the fact that those cases actually have something to do with corruption, and corruption linked to service delivery projects. So in case you're wondering why our municipalities are dysfunctional, it's because whatever is not being done or is being done wrong, no one is doing anything to change that situation.
Did they say in the story why perhaps they were not being dealt with? Is it resources? What did they offer?
It's really not apparent. I mean, I think it's just a case of lack of willingness to prosecute, because maybe your interests are aligned with other forces. Because the SIU obviously did the investigation, handed over the documents, and all the NPA had to do was to move forward and prosecute. So it's 686. That's ridiculous. All
right. Well, let's hope that the new NPA boss, whoever that might be, is going to start to really sort of chip away at those numbers, because, as you say, it's enormous. Another story that grabbed your attention today?
Well, the MTN Nigeria, it's almost like a never-ending saga there. If you recall, not so long ago, MTN was fined about $5.2 billion for not deactivating certain SIM cards. And now we hear that they are now in line to be fined another $8.1 billion. And there's, again, talk of another $2 billion with respect to their tax affairs. What I did like, however, was that the two main Sunday newspapers, City Press and Sunday Times, actually had a very different take on the story. I mean, the Sunday Times is, looking at this more as a witch hunt, or basically almost suggesting that there's somebody trying to hound MTN out of Nigeria. Whereas City Press, there was a story almost written by a journalist, basically suggesting that there's a culture of non-compliance with regulatory issues in Nigeria, and literally the government is simply cracking down on that. So hopefully over time, the true story will emerge, because both stories seem quite convincing. And it's a matter of finding out as the story develops who actually is on the right.
Look, I mean, we're talking about intra-Africa trade. We're talking about this new trade agreement that the continent has signed to open up spaces. This kind of thing makes it very difficult. I mean, a number of companies have tried to get into Nigeria and pulled out over the years. At the top of my head, I think Woolworths is one of them. Tsoko-san might be another one. They've really struggled in Nigeria, and it seems that the regulatory environment is really difficult.
Yes, and I think whether the companies are South African or from other international markets, I think the whole cowboy approach into going into operations in developing world should stop. We need to respect the laws of the countries where we go to operate, the same way that we'll expect people to, respect our laws, such as, for instance, BEE is an issue for us. So if you're coming to do business in South Africa, accept that you will have to find a way of dealing with that legislative environment instead of actually just going, because there's this tendency of threatening countries and governments, but unless you let us operate as we see fit, we will withdraw our investment. You need to actually recognize that if you're going to operate in a country, that you can still do business and still be profitable and observe the laws of, and regulations of that country.
Okay, all right. Well, let's look at the newspapers, and I guess if you're going to go into other countries, you've got to find a way of just doing it right. And I say that because a new Nike ad marking the company's 30th anniversary Just Do It campaign features former National Football League quarterback Colin Kaepernick. Has received widespread backlash. Posts on social media show people destroying their Nike clothes in protest of the campaign, whilst other celebrity athletes such as Serena Williams and LeBron James have supported the campaign. Kaepernick was ousted 2 years ago from the NFL after he began kneeling during the national anthem, playing just before each match in protest of police brutality and racism in the United States. Well, the question that we're asking is, has Nike reached its goal with this campaign? Let's take a quick look at this commercial that's causing all this fuss.
Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. When they talk about the greatest team in the history of the sport, make sure it's your team. If you have only one hand, don't just watch football, play it at the highest level. And if you're a girl from Compton, don't just become a tennis player. Become the greatest athlete ever. Yeah, that's more like it. So don't ask if your dreams are crazy. Ask if they're crazy enough.
Ask if you're crazy enough. Is Nike crazy doing this?
Absolutely not. I think, you have two types of companies or brands, the trailblazers and the also run. And I think Nike is clearly showing that, they are a market leader by doing this. I mean, to me, this goes beyond just branding. We've been talking for years now about the triple bottom line reporting, people, society, the environment. When it comes to society, companies tend to report about what they've done for CSI. How about reporting on the voice, the advocacy, the things that you stood up for in society that you feel ought to be changed, or things that we need to look at differently? And Nike is doing exactly that. That, there's something here that is not right, and let's start looking at that.
So what you're saying is that in a way, only so many people watch NFL anyway, as a beginning point.
Yes.
So are you saying that they are perhaps exposing their brand to people who probably don't watch football, but now are going to like the Nike brand because it stood for some social thing that's important.
No, absolutely. And also, I mean, nothing Nike recognizes that US is not their only market anyway. And I think they knew that this was going to be controversial. And obviously now it's gone global. Nike is now, it's a global brand, and they have to think about that in terms of their positioning and those kind of things. And in a society that we were talking earlier about how, you know, right-wing political parties are taking hold and, you know, things just seem to be going haywire. It's good to know that there's a voice of reason and they're positioning themselves as such.
All right, so let me ask you this. Is this a sincere sort of backing of an important social cause, or is this pure marketing where they knew that this thing was going to cause flames and as a result cause all this controversy, but their brand will benefit from that? I mean, it's not new. I remember in the 1990s, Benetton did the same. They came up with a shock ad campaign, and we spent a lot of time talking about it, but in talking about it, guess what happens? The brand gets more recognition. Could this be just another Benetton trick, or do you think they genuinely care about the cause?
Well, to find out if they really care about the cause, we have to look at all the other things that they're doing. I mean, a lot of the sort of the manufacturers of this what you call them, sneakers, for instance, have been accused in the past of using sweatshops. So you can't go out there and say, you know, this is what we stand for in terms of values and integrity and all those things. And meanwhile, you're still getting your sneakers manufactured in some sweatshop somewhere in Southeast Asia. So one will have to look at all the entire depth and breadth of their activities to say, okay, this is not just a marketing gimmick. Because we find that a lot. I mean, I remember a case here in South Africa where Nedbank once had that campaign called Ask Once.
Right.
Now, the question is, did people actually really ask once before a problem was solved, or you had to go through several phone calls?
Yeah.
I don't know. If it was really deep-rooted within the organization as part of the organizational culture, then it would have transformed the organization. I'm not sure if it did.
We're showing these Benetton ads now, and they were really controversial at the time, I remember, and they've been celebrating, I think, their 30th as well, and quite radical. But what it did is that it kind of set the brand apart. They weren't afraid to jump in there. This priest kissing a nun and a Jewish and a Palestinian guy sitting next to each other. You know, shocking. Yes. And I just wonder if Nike, they're not pushing that button a little bit, because we're talking about it. It's a Sunday morning, we're having a conversation, and Nike's getting free advertising.
Absolutely. So from a marketing perspective, absolutely. I mean, it works. But I'm hoping that it goes beyond branding. Like I said, only time will tell if this is really a reflection of how Nike feels about a whole range of issues. But I think the idea was obviously to make sure that they come up with a campaign that will get the attention and, you know, increase the level of brand affinity that people have. Obviously, there are some who obviously opposed to the campaign.
So, yeah, I heard there could be more than 30,000 people who recorded themselves burning Nike clothing. And I just wonder, what does that do to brand equity? Or do you just sort of balance it out and say, more people are going to come back and say, hang on, we are going to go buy Nike stuff in protest of those people that are burning theirs?
No, absolutely, because for starters, the fact that I think the global attention was raised by the fact that people were banning Nike footwear and other items. So that in itself actually helped the campaign rather than...
Gosh, so the NFL now is in a difficult situation because they're sponsored by Nike until 2028 for all their uniforms. How do they manage this? They're also under pressure. Kaepernick has taken them to court, saying that they're colluded to keep him out of the NFL. So the NFL brand is going to take a hit as a result of this, I'm sure.
Well, in a way, yes. But also, I'm wondering if they're hoping to get some, kudos for being associated with Nike and the Nike campaign itself and what the campaign stands for. So that's a slightly messy situation, and time will tell how it will eventually be resolved.
All right, Shoni, I wish we could chat and carry on talking for a while, but unfortunately time is not on our side. But thanks very much indeed for your insights and coming through to the studio. Thanks so much.
It's a pleasure, Peter. Thank you so much.
All right, and that's where we're going to leave Media Monitor for today. Thanks very much for joining us, and join us again next week at the same time for pretty much more of the same. Have a great Sunday, everybody. Bye-bye.